3:42 in the morning. The central Baltic Sea, 80 miles north of the Polish coast. The Russian nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine, Kazan, a Project 885 Mike vessel, hung motionless in the lightless depths of the Gotland Basin. At 300 meters below the surface, the water was a crushing weight of 4 degrees Celsius, a silent graveyard of salt and silt that had swallowed the secrets of a dozen wars. Inside the hull, the Kazan was a different world, defined by the low, rhythmic thrum of its nuclear reactor and the faint metallic tang of recirculated oxygen and polymer coating. Usually, a predator of this class would be shadowed by a hunter-killer group from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But tonight, the Kazan was a ghost. Somewhere in the secure compartments of the command deck, a single encrypted flash signal from the Northern Fleet headquarters had changed everything, turning a routine underwater patrol into the opening move of a continental catastrophe. The atmosphere in the central command post was thick with the smell of machine grease and the sharp ozone bite of high-voltage electronics. Captain First Rank Viktor Denisov stood by the primary navigation console, his eyes fixed on the digital bathymetric chart. The deck beneath his boots shuddered with a microscopic vibration, the only physical evidence of the massive power being harnessed within the reactor shield. For 72 hours, the Kazan had maintained total radio silence, drifting at a speed of only 3 knots to minimize its hydroacoustic signature. They were sitting in a blind spot, a pocket of thermal layers where the sonar of passing Polish and German frigates would bounce off, the temperature gradients like light off a mirror. The mission was precise, clinical, and devastating. 120 miles to the south lay the Port of Gdansk, a sprawling industrial complex that had become the beating heart of the Alliance's logistics network. In the last 14 days, over 60 M1A, 2 SEPV-3 tanks, 140 Bradley fighting vehicles, and 300,000 artillery shells had moved through those piers. It was the throat of the Western reinforcement effort, and the Kazan was here to cut it. Denisov looked at his executive officer, who held a physical launch key tethered to his wrist by a steel cable. There was no hesitation in the room, only the cold, practiced discipline of men who had spent their lives preparing for a morning that no one truly believed would come. Behind the command center, in the vertical launch compartments, the silence was absolute. 32 silos, arranged in 8 massive clusters, held a mix of Kalibr and Oniks cruise missiles. These were not mere weapons, they were sophisticated robotic hunters, each one programmed with the GPS coordinates of fuel depots, ammunition piers, and crane assemblies. In Gdansk, the missiles sat in their pressurized canisters, bathed in nitrogen, their guidance systems already spinning up, drinking in the targeting data fed to them by the submarine's combat management system. At 3:48 in the morning, Denisov gave the order to flood the silos. The sound was a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the steel ribs of the submarine as seawater rushed into the gaps between the missile canisters and the outer hull. The weight of the Kazan shifted almost imperceptibly, the trim tanks compensating for the sudden influx of mass. On the sonar screens, the ocean around them remained empty. The nearest Alliance vessel, a Polish Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate, was 45 miles to the west, its crew likely focused on the routine task of monitoring civilian shipping lanes. They had no idea that 100 feet of vertical steel was about to erupt from the waves. The external environment of the Baltic Sea was deceptive in its stillness. Above the Kazan, the surface was whipped by a biting wind from the northeast, scattering whitecaps across a black horizon. The air smelled of salt and the Player Gulsam, wet, heavy scent of a coming storm. Beneath that surface, the submarine prepared to break the peace of 30 years. Denisov gripped the edge of the chart table as the final countdown began. The unanswered question that hung in the recycled air was not whether the missiles would hit their marks, but what would be left of the world once the fires in Gdansk were finally extinguished. "Prepare for launch," Denisov whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. Launch sequence initiated. Tubes 1 through 8, weapons free. A deep, resonant thud echoed through the length of the Kazan as the first high-pressure gas generator ignited. It was a sound that felt more like a physical blow to the chest than a noise. The first Kalibr missile was punched out of its tube, a 10-ton spear of high explosives and jet fuel hurtling toward the surface. It was followed 3 seconds later by the second, then the third. Each launch sent a shudder through the deck, a rhythmic mechanical heartbeat that signaled the beginning of the end for the logistics hub in Poland. The Kazan had revealed itself, and the Baltic Sea was no longer a place of silence. 3:52 in the morning. The surface of the central Baltic Sea. The first Kalibr cruise missile broke the water like a breaching whale, propelled by a high-pressure gas charge that sent 10 tons of steel and high explosives 20 meters into the freezing air, before the solid fuel booster ignited. The transition was violent and spectacular, a sudden eruption of white-orange flame that bleached the darkness of the pre-dawn sky and turned the surrounding salt spray into a cloud of instantaneous steam. The roar of the rocket motor was a physical weight, a screeching, guttural sound that tore through the wind and echoed off the churning waves for miles in every direction. As the booster fell away, the missile's stubby wings flicked outward, and the small turbojet engine kicked into life, settling the weapon into a steady, subsonic hum just 15 meters above the waterline. Within 90 seconds, the Kazan had emptied its first 16 vertical launch tubes. The horizon was no longer black. It was a grid of receding white light, as 16 Kalibr cruise missiles and 16 Oniks supersonic missiles streaked toward the Polish coastline. The Oniks missiles were different, faster, and far more aggressive, their ramjet engines glowing a fierce cherry red as they accelerated toward Mach 2.5, trailing a sonic boom that cracked across the empty sea like a series of heavy artillery discharges. The air in the wake of the launch smelled of burnt chemicals, acrid ammonium perchlorate, and the scorched iron of the launch canisters. It was a localized environmental catastrophe, a 30-mile stretch of the Baltic Sea now choked with the toxic exhaust of a superpower's opening move. 400 miles to the west, inside the hardened concrete bunkers of the Combined Air Operations Center in Uedem, Germany, the quiet of the night shift ended in a heartbeat. A technician monitoring the feed from a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, E-3 Sentry Airborne Warning and Control System, circling over the Polish-Lithuanian border saw the first flicker of heat. It was a massive infrared signature, a bloom of energy in the middle of a supposedly empty sector of the Baltic. 2 seconds later, the high-altitude radar of the E-3 Sentry caught the physical returns. The system did not see 32 individual missiles at first. It saw a swarm, a cluster of high-speed contacts emerging from the depths and fanning out in a lethal, coordinated geometry toward the Port of Gdansk. Vampire, vampire, vampire. The tactical controller shouted into his headset, his voice tight with the sudden realization of what he was looking at. Multiple inbound cruise missiles, Sector 105. Tracking 30-plus hostile contacts. Origin point Central Baltic. Coordinates 55 degrees north, 19 degrees east. The warning flashed across the integrated air and missile defense network, a digital scream that bypassed human decision-making and went straight to the automated engagement systems of the Polish Air Defense Force. At the Polish air base in Malbork, the alarms were not the rising and falling sirens of the Cold War. They were a series of sharp digital pulses that signaled an immediate existential threat. Within the fortified hangars, the ground crews scrambled toward the F-16 Fighting Falcons and the newer F-35 Lightning II aircraft, but they were already too late to intercept the first wave. The cruise missiles were flying too low, hugging the contour of the waves to hide in the radar clutter of the sea's surface. On the outskirts of Gdansk, tucked between the coastal pine forests and the industrial suburbs, the batteries of the Patriot Advanced Capability 3 missile system began to rotate. The AN-SPY-6 radar arrays tracked the incoming threats, their computers performing millions of calculations per second to determine which missiles posed the first, greatest danger to the port. The crews inside the command vans were bathed in the blue glow of tactical displays, their hands hovering over the engagement buttons. They could see the Oniks missiles closing the distance at over 2,000 kilometers per hour, a speed that left less than 4 minutes of reaction time from detection to impact. The atmosphere in the city of Gdansk remained eerily still. A light fog had begun to roll in from the Bay of Pomerania, smelling of coal smoke and wet asphalt. Most of the population was asleep, unaware that 32,000 kilograms of high explosives were currently screaming across the water toward their doorsteps. On the piers of Upsend, the deep water container terminal, the night shift crane operators continued to hoist heavy crates of NATO ammunition from the deck of a massive transport ship. The only warning they had was a sudden, low-frequency vibration in the air, a sound that was more felt in the marrow of their bones than heard with their ears. The iron rain was coming, and the defensive umbrella of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was about to be tested to its absolute breaking point. 3:54 in the morning. The central Baltic Sea approach to the Bay of Gdansk. The 16 Oniks missiles, traveling at a staggering speed of 2,700 kilometers per hour, became the primary focus of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's Eastern Flank Air Defense Network as they crossed the maritime border of Poland. Flying in a lead trail formation, these supersonic predators were sea-skimming at an altitude of only 10 meters, tucked so low into the wave troughs that the spray from the whitecaps was being vaporized by the heat of their ramjet intakes. At this height, the curvature of the Earth and the chaotic radar reflections from the churning sea surface created a wall of electronic noise, making it nearly impossible for ground-based sensors to maintain a consistent track on the incoming threat. The technical complexity of the flight path was a masterpiece of cold, calculated geometry designed to overwhelm the decision-making cycles of human operators. While the supersonic Oniks missiles acted as the high-speed vanguard to draw the attention of the defensive batteries, the 16 Kalibr cruise missiles followed 10 miles behind, hugging the coastline at a much slower speed of 800 kilometers per hour. These slower weapons utilized a sophisticated terrain contour matching system, weaving through the jagged coastal cliffs and the dense pine forests of the Pomeranian region to mask their acoustic and thermal signatures against the cold morning ground. The air in their wake was a turbulent mess of salt, air and kerosene exhaust, an invisible trail of chemical breadcrumbs that led straight to the heart of the Alliance's most critical supply node. At the Gdynia Naval Base, the first of the Polish Patriot Advanced Capability 3 batteries came to full combat readiness, its 4 missile canisters tilting toward the northeast at a 60-degree angle. The AN/SPY-6 radar array had finally locked onto a cluster of 4 Oniks missiles that had briefly popped up to an altitude of 20 meters to perform a final terminal seeker sweep. The command to engage was transmitted through a fiber optic link to the launch stations in less than half a second. The first interceptor erupted from its canister in a violent burst of flame and debris, the solid fuel motor punching the 300-kilogram missile into the sky with an acceleration that produced a visible shockwave against the morning mist. The engagement was a frantic, high-stakes game of electronic cat-and-mouse played out in the span of heartbeats. The Oniks missiles detected the radar illumination from this Patriot battery and immediately initiated their onboard electronic countermeasure suites, flooding the local frequency bands with digital noise and false target returns. One of the Russian missiles performed a violent 10G corkscrew maneuver, its thrust vectoring nozzles glowing white-hot as it fought to break the lock of the approaching interceptor. The cold Baltic air was suddenly filled with the intersecting streaks of white rocket exhaust and the orange glow of burning propellant, a chaotic tapestry of light that signaled the beginning of the kinetic struggle for the Polish coast. 2 miles off the coast of Hel Peninsula, the first successful interception occurred. A Patriot interceptor, traveling at Mach 4, slammed into the lead Oniks missile with the force of a high-speed locomotive. There was no explosion of high explosives, The sheer kinetic energy of the collision turned both the interceptor and the cruise missile into a cloud of glowing titanium fragments and burning jet fuel. The debris rained down into the dark waters of the Baltic, a momentary flash of light that bleached the sky for 3 seconds before the darkness rushed back in. But for every missile destroyed, 3 more were already screaming past the defensive line, their seekers locked onto the massive metal signatures of the cranes and fuel tanks waiting in the port of Gdansk. Logistically, the defensive effort was already facing a critical bottleneck that would haunt the alliance in the hours to come. Each Patriot interceptor cost nearly $4 million and took months to manufacture, yet they were being expended in seconds against a swarm of missiles that had been launched by a single submarine. The supply of ready-to-fire interceptors at the Gdynia battery was down to 60% within the first 4 minutes of the engagement, and the nearest resupply convoy was currently struggling with heavy traffic and narrow roads 200 miles to the south. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was winning the first few seconds of the battle, but the weight of the Russian strike was beginning to crush the local capacity to resist. The air over the Bay of Gdansk was thick with the smell of ozone and the distant, rolling thunder of supersonic booms. On the ground, the military police units guarding the entrance to the deep-water container terminal finally received the order to evacuate the civilian dockworkers. The unanswered question was no longer whether the port would be hit, but how much of the vital NATO equipment could be moved before the first warhead found its mark. The terminal velocity of the remaining missiles was now the only clock that mattered, and the hands were moving towards zero. 3:55 in the morning. The deep-water container terminal at the Port of Gdansk, known in North Atlantic Treaty Organization planning circles as the Iron Throat of the eastern flank, was a sprawling landscape of 300 hectares of reinforced concrete and high-tensile steel. Under the harsh, buzzing glow of 1,000 sodium vapor floodlights, the port was a hive of frantic, mechanized industry that had not stopped for a single second in over 14 days of continuous operations. The air was a thick, choking soup of diesel exhaust, the ozone smell of electric crane motors, and the freezing salt mist rolling in from the Bay of Pomerania, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere where the visibility was often less than 100 meters. At the center of this logistical storm sat the United States naval ship Brittin, a massive 95,000-ton large medium-speed roll-on roll-off vessel that was currently disgorging the heavy steel core of a modernized armored brigade. Across its cavernous internal decks, the engines of 60 M1A2 SEPV3 that was currently disgorging the heavy steel core of a modernized armored brigade. Main battle tanks were idling, their low-frequency vibration causing the very pier beneath them to tremble with a rhythmic, mechanical pulse. Each tank, weighing nearly 70 tons, represented a pinnacle of land warfare technology. Yet, here they were at their most vulnerable, sitting in tight, dense rows, while civilian contractors and Army transportation specialists worked to secure them to heavy-duty rail cars for the journey east. The logistics of the operation were a staggering display of sheer weight and volume that defied easy visualization for anyone outside of the Military Transportation Command. Adjacent to the tank park, Pier 4 was dominated by a mountain of 300,000 artillery shells, all of them 155mm high explosive rounds stacked in 15,000 treated wooden crates. This was the lifeblood of the Alliance's heavy artillery groups. A massive concentration of chemical energy that, if ignited, would be enough to level every structure within a 3-kilometer radius of the terminal. The supply chain was a fragile, high-tension wire stretched across the Atlantic. And tonight, Gdansk was the point where that wire was anchored to the European continent. Strategic planners had designated the Port of Gdansk as a critical, non-permissible environment, meaning its loss would effectively sever the primary reinforcement route for the Baltic states within 48 hours. The objective for the 3,000 military personnel and civilian workers on the ground was to maintain a flow of 5,000 tons of materiel per hour, a rate that required a perfectly synchronized ballet of ship-to-shore cranes, reach stackers, and heavy-lift helicopters. Every pallet moved was a tactical victory against the growing threat of a Russian blockade. But the concentration of so much high-value equipment in a single, fixed location had created a target of irresistible proportions for the Kazan. The sound of the port was a constant, deafening roar of grinding metal and screaming hydraulic lines that drowned out the distant, rolling thunder of the air defense engagement happening 50 miles to the north. On the main access road, a line of 400 heavy transport trucks waited with their engines running, their headlights cutting through the fog like 1,000 searching eyes. The drivers, many of them civilian contractors from Poland and Germany, leaned against their cabs and drank cold coffee, unaware that the supersonic Oniks missiles were already crossing the final radar gates of the outer harbor. Inside the port's primary security office, a small concrete bunker reinforced with sandbags and blast shutters, the atmosphere had suddenly shifted from industrial routine to pure, unadulterated panic. The tactical data link from the Polish Navy headquarters was now flashing a series of red icons that were closing the distance to the terminal at over 2,000 kilometers per hour. There was no time for an orderly evacuation of the 3,000 people working on the piers, and there was certainly no way to move 95,000 tons of shipping and 60 main battle tanks out of the line of fire. The environment of the port, once a symbol of alliance, power, and industrial might, had become a trap of steel and concrete. The smell of the sea was suddenly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of the terminal guidance seekers as they locked onto the massive infrared signatures of the idling tank engines. The workers on the Pier 4 ammunition dump looked up into bases. The black sky, hearing a sound that was no longer the wind or the cranes, but the high-pitched, terrifying scream of incoming ordnance that had finally found its target. 3:56 in the morning. The deepwater container terminal at the Port of Gdansk. The final 10 seconds of the peace in northern Poland were defined by a sound that no one on the ground had ever heard before. A low-frequency, pulsing throb that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of the dockworkers' bones. This was the acoustic signature of the Oniks missiles entering their terminal dive, their ramjet engines screaming at maximum thrust as they transitioned from sea skimming to a high-angle attack profile. The sodium lights of the port, which had bathed the thousands of tons of equipment in a clinical yellow glow, were suddenly competing with a series of rapidly expanding white dots in the northern sky. There was no time for sirens, no time for radio warnings, and no time for a final prayer. The transition from industrial routine to a landscape of fire and shredded steel happened in the span of 3 heartbeats. The terminal seekers of the lead Oniks missiles locked onto the massive thermal bloom of the port's primary fuel farm, where 12 massive storage tanks held the lifeblood of the Alliance's air and ground operations. The first weapon slammed into the central storage tank at over 2,000 kilometers per hour. The warhead punched straight through the 5-centimeter thick steel plating before detonating in a 400-kilogram high-explosive burst. The impact shredded the internal structure of the tank, sending 3 million liters of ignited P-8 aviation fuel skyward in a pillar of orange fire that bleached the sky white for 10 miles. A massive shockwave followed, a wall of compressed air that crushed the chest of every worker within 500 meters and shattered every reinforced window in the terminal district. On Pier 4, the second missile drove into the heart of the ammunition crates, the kinetic energy alone sufficient to initiate the sympathetic detonation of 10,000 artillery shells. The explosion was a blinding flash that vaporized the wooden crates and sent jagged steel fragments of the pier flying into the hull of the USS Brittin, tearing through its unarmored side like paper. Men were thrown like ragdolls by the pressure and the roar of the blast cracked eardrums, leaving a ringing silence in its wake as the first thick coils of black oil smoke began to blot out the stars. The atmospheric pressure change from the dual explosions was so violent that it momentarily extinguished the smaller fires on the periphery, only for the searing heat to reignite them seconds later. The smell of the Baltic Sea was gone, replaced by the suffocating, chemical bite of burning propellant, vaporized diesel, and the iron-rich scent of blood. The light from the fuel farm fire was so intense that it cast long, dancing shadows of the port's massive cranes across the bay, making the steel structures look like skeletal giants watching over a funeral pyre. The temperature in the center of the impact zone at the fuel farm spiked to over 1,000 degrees Celsius, melting the asphalt of the service roads and fusing the steel tracks of the rail yard into useless, twisted ribbons of slag. On the deck of the USS Brittin, the chaos was absolute. The ship had taken a massive hit from the debris of the ammunition pier, and the shockwave had caused the 95,000-ton vessel to list 5 degrees to the port side. Inside the cavernous vehicle decks, the 60 M1A2 SEP-V3 tanks, which had been perfectly aligned in their transit rows, were tossed against each other like toy cars. The sound of 70-ton tanks slamming into the bulkheads and each other was a cacophony of grinding metal and snapping tie-down chains. One tank was flipped onto its side, its turret crushed by the weight of the vehicle next to it, while several others began to leak highly flammable hydraulic fluid onto the deck. The ship's fire suppression systems triggered automatically, filling the air with a thick, white chemical mist that blinded the surviving crew members as they stumbled through the dark, trying to find their way to the upper decks. In the neighboring rail yard, the scene was no less catastrophic. The 400 transport trucks that had been waiting to carry the supplies east were now a graveyard of twisted aluminum and shattered glass. The shockwave had rolled the trucks over, spilling their contents across the concrete. A third missile, a slower Kalibr that had successfully navigated the coastal forests, impacted the primary rail switching station, ensuring that even if the equipment could be salvaged, it would have no way to leave the port. The bridge connecting the terminal to the main highway was severed. The oily waters of the harbor with a splash that sent a wave of black water over the burning wreckage of the nearby tugboats. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of hellish, flickering light and thick, oily smoke that rose thousands of feet into the cold morning air. The Port of Gdansk, the vital artery of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's eastern defense, had been effectively neutralized in less than 60 seconds. The Kazan had not just destroyed buildings, equipment, it had shattered the logistics schedule of an entire continent. As the secondary explosions from the ammunition pier continued to ripple through the harbor, sound echoing like the drums of a receding storm, the realization began to set in among the survivors. The war was no longer something happening on a map in a bunker in Germany. It was here, and the cost of the first strike was already measured in thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of lives. 4:15 in the morning. The Port of Gdansk was no longer a gateway for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a 300-hectare graveyard of scorched titanium and shattered logistics. The black smoke from the burning fuel farm rose in a vertical column, 2,000 meters high, a pillar of carbon that blotted out the early morning stars and carried the acrid, chemical stench of vaporized JP-8 aviation fuel over the city's historic center. Beneath the smoke, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic, metallic groan of the USS Brittin as the 95,000-ton vessel continued to settle into the silt of the harbor floor. Its hull breached in 4 places by the secondary explosions of the ammunition pier. The scale of the logistics collapse was catastrophic, a mathematical nightmare for the strategic planners at United States European Command. In 60 seconds of kinetic impact, the Alliance had lost 60 M1A2 SEP-V3 tanks, which represented the entire heavy armor corps of the incoming Armored Brigade combat team. These tanks, each costing over $15 million and requiring months of specialized maintenance to remain combat-ready, were now twisted heaps of heat-treated steel, their sensitive electronics fried by the 1,000-degree temperatures and their internal systems contaminated by seawater and chemical foam. The loss of these 60 platforms meant that the planned counteroffensive in the Suwalki Gap was effectively neutralized before it could even begin. Worse than the loss of the tanks was the total evaporation of the ammunition stockpile. 300,000 artillery shells, 155mm high-explosive rounds had been reduced to a layer of jagged, hot shrapnel that covered every square inch of the terminal. This was not just a loss of material, it was a loss of 3 weeks of sustained combat power for the entire eastern flank. Without these shells, the heavy artillery groups currently positioned along the border with Belarus were reduced to a defensive posture, limited to whatever rounds they already had in their ready racks. The just-in-time logistics chain, the pride of the modern Western military machine, had proven to be a single point of failure that the Russian Northern Fleet had exploited with surgical precision. On the ground, the medical and recovery effort was a scene of organized desperation. Military police and Polish emergency responders moved through the wreckage of the truck park, where 400 heavy transport vehicles had been tossed like discarded toys. The air smelled of burnt rubber, diesel, and the iron-rich scent of a mass casualty event. At the improvised triage center, established 2 kilometers from the impact zone, the medical officers were dealing with hundreds of cases of severe blast overpressure and chemical burns. The evacuation of the wounded was hampered by the fact that the primary access roads were choked with debris and the main rail line was a twisted wreck of steel. The damage to the port's infrastructure was perhaps the most enduring blow. The 3 massive ship-to-shore cranes, each standing over 80 meters tall and weighing 2,000 tons, had been buckled by the heat of the fuel farm fire. They leaned at precarious angles, their high-tensile steel cables snapped and whipping in the wind. Without these cranes, the Port of Gdansk could no longer unload the heavy equipment necessary to sustain a modern mechanized war. The deep water berths were now clogged with the wreckage of the ammunition pier and the sinking hull of the USS Brittin, creating a navigational hazard that would take weeks, if not months, to clear. Strategic analysts in Washington and Brussels stared at their screens, in stunned silence as the damage reports filtered in. The Kazan had achieved a strategic victory without a single tank-on-tank engagement. By striking the logistics hub, the Russian submarine had effectively severed the throat of the alliance's reinforcement route. The question was no longer how to win the war in the east, but how to keep the front lines supplied now that their primary artery was gushing black smoke into the Polish sky. The logistics report was a document of total failure, and the cost was written in the lives of the 342 personnel confirmed killed in the first 10 minutes of the strike. The environmental detail was the final insult to the once pristine Baltic coastline. The harbor water, usually a cold and clear blue, was now a thick, black slurry of spilled oil and fire-suppressant chemicals. Dead fish floated among the debris of wooden crates and charred life vests. The wind from the northeast continued to howl, spreading the oily soot over the residential districts of Gdansk. A grim reminder to the civilian population that the safety of the last 30 years had evaporated in a single morning. The hub was gone, and the war was just beginning to find its stride. 5:20 in the morning. The central Baltic Sea, 80 miles north of the Polish coastline. High above the churning, iron-gray waves, a United States Navy P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft banked hard to port, its 2 massive jet engines humming with a low-frequency vibration that resonated through the reinforced fuselage. Inside the windowless tactical compartment, the air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and stale coffee. 6 sensor operators sat bathed in the dim blue light of their workstations, their eyes locked onto the cascading waterfalls of acoustic data flowing in from the Sonobuoy fields dropped minutes earlier. The mission was no longer a routine patrol. It was a desperate, high-stakes hunt for the Ghost that had just decapitated the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's primary logistics hub. The P-8 Poseidon moved with clinical precision, flying a deliberate, cloverleaf search pattern at an altitude of only 500 feet. Every 30 seconds, the pneumatic launch tubes in the rear of the aircraft hissed, punching another AN SSQ-53 passive directional sonobuoy into the freezing air. The buoys hit the water with a splash, deployed their hydrophones to a depth of 100 meters, and began broadcasting the secret heartbeat of the ocean back to the aircraft via secure radio link. The operators were listening for a specific sound, the rhythmic, metallic shick-shick of a 7-bladed skewed propeller, or the WS, faint, high-frequency whine of a nuclear reactor's coolant pumps. But the Baltic Sea was a cacophony of noise. The echoes of the missile launches still reverberated off the underwater ridges, and the transit of heavy civilian tankers created a wall of acoustic clutter that masked the Kazan's escape. 30 miles to the south, the Polish frigate ORP General Kazimierz Pulaski was cutting through 4-meter swells at a speed of 28 knots, its hull slamming into the waves with a violence that sent sheets of freezing spray over the bridge windows. The ship's hull-mounted sonar was operating in active mode, sending out powerful pings of sound that traveled through the water like underwater searchlights. The sound of the sonar pulses, a haunting, high-pitched metallic chirp, echoed through the lower decks of the frigate, a constant reminder to the crew that they were hunting a predator that could strike back at any moment. The captain of the Pulaski stood on the bridge, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing, staring into the dark horizon where the smoke from Gdansk was a faint, black smudge against the coming dawn. Beneath the surface, the Kazan was executing a masterful evasion. Captain Denisov had taken the submarine deep, hugging the jagged contours of a submerged glacial trench where the sonar returns from the Polish frigate would bounce erratically off the granite walls. The Kazan was moving at a crawl speed of only 3 knots, its electric drive motor operating in near total silence. The crew moved in socks, speaking only in whispers, and every non-essential piece of machinery, including the galley ovens and the laundry, had been shut down to eliminate any parasitic noise. The submarine was no longer a vessel. It was a hole in the water, a silent shadow that was slowly drifting toward the deeper, more complex thermal layers of the silent Northern Baltic. The technical challenge for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization hunters was the thermal layer, a sharp boundary where the water temperature dropped 10 degrees in the span of a few meters. This layer acted as an acoustic mirror, reflecting sonar waves back toward the surface and allowing a submarine to hide in the shadow zone beneath it. The P-8 Poseidon operators saw the layer on their bathythermograph readings and knew their passive buoys were likely blind to anything deeper than 60 meters. To counter this, the aircraft commander ordered the deployment of active die-cast buoys, directional command-activated sonobuoy system, which would blast the depths with high-energy sound pulses to force an echo from Sadokas, the Kazan's titanium hull. Contact. Possible transient. Bearing 340. The lead acoustic sensor operator shouted, his voice cracking with tension. He pointed to a faint vertical line on his screen that had appeared for less than 2 seconds. It sounded like a mechanical snap. Could be a hatch closure or a high-pressure airburst. The P-8 Poseidon immediately pivoted, the pilot pushing the throttles forward as the aircraft raced toward the coordinates. 3 more active sonobuoys were punched out in a tight triangular pattern around the contact point. In the water, the buoys began to ping, their signals cutting through the dark silence of the trench. On the bridge of the Pulaski, the sonar officer reported a possible submerged contact, and the frigate began to turn, its deck-mounted torpedo tubes swiveling toward the target area. The hunt was narrowing, the electronic net tightening around the Russian ghost. However, the environment of the Baltic remained the Kazan's greatest ally. A sudden rain squall moved in from the north, the heavy droplets hitting the sea surface with enough force to create a bassa, massive amount of ambient sea noise that effectively blinded the airborne sensors. The smell of the salt air in the P-8 Poseidon's cockpit was replaced by the cold, damp scent of the storm. For the next 10 minutes, the acoustic screens turned to a solid blur of white noise. By the time the squall passed, the faint contact was gone. The Kazan had used the noise of the rain to execute a snap turn and increase speed to 10 knots, slipping away into the vast, dark expanse of the northern basins. The hunt would continue, but for now, the ghost had vanished back into the deep. 6:15 in the morning. The perimeter of the Port of Gdansk. The 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, supported by elements of the Polish 4th Border Protection Brigade, began the grueling task of establishing a 3-kilometer defensive cordon around the burning ruins of the logistics hub. The sky was no longer black, but a bruised, sickly purple, choked by the massive column of soot that continued to pour from the decimated fuel farm. The air was a thick, abrasive fog that tasted of burnt rubber and high-octane chemicals, forcing every soldier and Marine to wear tactical respirators that muffled their voices into rhythmic, mechanical rasps. The primary strategic objective was the immediate stabilization of the Iron Belt, a series of hasty checkpoints and overwatch positions designed to prevent any further sabotage and to clear the way for emergency logistics. The M1A2 SEP V3 tanks that had survived the initial shockwave were positioned at key intersections, their thermal optic scanning the heavy smoke for any signs of secondary Russian Spetsnaz teams or low-flying drones. These 70-ton Predators looked like prehistoric beasts in the gloom, their engines idling with a low-frequency growl that was frequently drowned out by the scream of sirens and the distant, rhythmic thud of secondary explosions still rocking the harbor. The logistical nightmare of the recovery effort was the most immediate challenge facing the command staff. Under the flickering orange light of the fires, MH-60 Sierra helicopters from the United States Navy hovered precariously over the buckled piers, their rotor wash whipping the black, oily water into a frenzy as they lowered search and rescue swimmers into the debris. The medevac operation was a frantic race against time. Over 400 personnel were still unaccounted for, and the improvised triage center at the edge of the terminal was already overwhelmed with cases of extreme blast lung and third-degree chemical burns. Every 45 minutes, a convoy of armored ambulances moved through the cordon, their tires crunching over the jagged carpets of glass and shrapnel that covered the access roads. To the east of the main gate, a company of Marine combat engineers worked with heavy bulldozers to clear the primary supply route. The road was a graveyard of burnt-out transport trucks and twisted shipping containers that had been thrown hundreds of meters by the ammunition pier detonation. The physical effort was immense. The heat radiating from the nearby wreckage was so intense that it softened the rubber of the Marines' boots, and the constant rain of black soot turned their camouflage into a uniform charcoal gray. They worked in silence, punctuated only by the grinding of steel against concrete as they pushed the remains of 40-ton trailers into the drainage ditches to make room for the incoming fire suppression equipment. Tactically, the situation remained highly volatile. Intelligence reports suggested that the Kazan was not the only Russian asset in the region, and the integrated air defense network was still operating at maximum readiness. The Polish commander of the 4th Border Protection Brigade coordinated with the American battalion commander inside a mobile command post, a reinforced Stryker vehicle parked behind a screen of blast-resistant barriers. They were mapping out a secondary logistics route that bypassed the destroyed rail bridge, a plan that required the rapid deployment of mobile ribbon bridges across the nearby canal. Without this connection, the thousands of tons of ammunition and fuel currently sitting on trains 50 miles to the south would never reach the units at the front. The environment around the port was a sensory assault. The sound of the fires was a constant, low-pitched roar, like a jet engine that refused to shut down. The smell of the sea had been completely obliterated, replaced by the suffocating scent of vaporized diesel and something more metallic, the smell of a modern army being ground into scrap. Occasionally, a massive piece of the destroyed ship-to-shore cranes would groan and settle, sending a fresh shower of sparks into the air. The Marines of the 1st Battalion stayed low in their fighting holes, their fingers on the triggers of their M27 infantry automatic rifles, staring into a landscape that had been transformed from a professional military hub into a scene from a post-apocalyptic nightmare. As the sun began to rise behind the wall of smoke, the reality of the defeat settled over the defensive perimeter. The iron throat of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had been crushed, and the men on the ground were now the only thing standing, between the ruins of Gdansk and total chaos. The logistics of the war had changed from a matter of scheduled arrivals to a desperate struggle for survival and salvage. "6:20 in the morning. The central Baltic Sea, north of the Stolpe Bank. The maritime environment had become a landscape of jagged, 4-meter swells and horizontal rain that tasted of salt and frozen iron. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Mason, hull number DDG-87, was now the primary hunter on the scene, its 4 massive gas turbine engines pushing the 9,000-ton warship through the heavy seas at 32 knots. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was a pressurized vault of blue light and electronic tension. The air smelled of recycled cooling fans and the faint, metallic scent of floor wax. Every sailor in the room was wearing flash protective gear, their faces obscured by fire-resistant masks, their eyes locked onto the ANSPY-6 radar consoles and the sonar repeaters that were struggling to find a solid fix on the Kazan. The tactical situation was a high-speed chess match played in 3 dimensions. The Kazan had been forced to increase its speed to escape the tightening net of sonobuoys dropped by the P-8 Poseidon, but in doing so, it had surrendered its primary advantage of silence. The submarine was now leaving a faint but detectable acoustic trail, a rhythmic blade rate signature that the USS Mason's towed array sonar was tracking with increasing clarity. The Polish frigate General Kazimierz Pulaski was 3 miles to the east, acting as a pinger, using its active sonar to flush the Russian submarine toward the deeper water. Where the Mason was waiting with its Mark 41 vertical launch system, the Kazan finally bit back. From the forward torpedo tubes, 2 650mm wake-homing torpedoes were ejected with a muffled, high-pressure grunt of air that vibrated through the hull of every ship in the vicinity. These were not traditional acoustic seekers. They were designed to sniff out the turbulent, bubbly wake of a surface ship and follow it like a bloodhound to the propellers. The weapons ignited their thermal batteries and accelerated to 60 knots, their contrails cutting through the dark water toward the Polish frigate. The impact was a catastrophic eruption at the ship's stern. The first torpedo punched through the steering gear and detonated against the propeller shafts with a force that lifted the 4,000-ton frigate's rear out of the water. Steel groaned and snapped as the rudder was sheared off entirely, sent flying 50 meters into the air. A second explosion followed a heartbeat later, a massive fireball of vaporized fuel and seawater that bleached the dark horizon. The Pulaski began to settle by the stern immediately, its engines screaming in a high-pitched death rattle before falling silent. On the bridge of the nearby destroyer, USS Mason, the commanding officer reacted instantly, shouting the order to launch an anti-submarine rocket. The Mark 41 vertical launch system erupted with a pillar of white fire as the rocket-assisted torpedo roared into the sky, tracking the Kazan's last known position. The sea surface was transformed into a boiling cauldron of white foam and black oil. As the rocket plummeted back into the water 2 miles away, its sonar seeker pinging with a lethal, high-frequency scream. The shockwave from the Pulaski's destruction rolled across the water, hitting the USS Mason with a physical jolt that caused the deck to shudder beneath the sailors' feet. The sound of the explosion was a deep, guttural roar that seemed to swallow the wind and the rain for 5 full seconds. In the immediate aftermath, the Polish frigate sat dead in the water, a jagged ruin of twisted aluminum and burning insulation. Black smoke boiled out of the gaping hole where the stern had been, and the only sound was the hissing of seawater hitting the white-hot metal of the engine room. The Kazan had used the chaos of the impact to dive even deeper, pushing past its rated test depth to seek the safety of the dark, silt-heavy bottom of the basin. Logistically, the loss of the Pulaski was a severe blow to the anti-submarine screen. The USS Mason was now forced to split its attention between hunting the Kazan and coordinating the rescue of the Polish sailors who were jumping into the freezing Baltic waters. The water temperature was only 4 degrees Celsius. Without immediate recovery, the survivors would succumb to hypothermia in less than 15 minutes. The destroyer's executive officer ordered the deployment of the MH-60 Sierra helicopter, but the aircraft had to battle the gale force winds and the thick, oily smoke rising from the wreck. The hunt for the Kazan was no longer a clinical operation. It was a desperate, multi-front struggle against a predator that had proven it was just as dangerous when cornered as when it was on the hunt. The environment of the Baltic Sea seemed to conspire against the survivors. The rain turned to sleet, stinging the skin of the men in the water and coating the USS Mason's decks in a treacherous layer of slush. The smell of burning diesel from the frigate was suffocating, mixing with the sharp ozone of the Mason's own defensive systems. The Kazan was still out there, somewhere beneath thermal layers, silent once more. It had cleared its path through the blockade, leaving a burning NATO warship in its wake as a grim testament to its power. 6:45 in the morning. The central Baltic Sea and the smoking ruins of the Port of Gdansk. The transition from high-intensity kinetic combat to the grueling, silent struggle of medical recovery began as the first light of a cold, gray dawn struggled to penetrate the wall of black soot hanging over the Polish coast. In the water north of the Stolpe Bank, the environment was an unforgiving landscape of 4 degrees Celsius saltwater and choking diesel slicks. 128 sailors from the Polish frigate General Kazimierz Pulaski were now fighting a battle against physics and biology. In water this cold, the human body has less than 15 minutes before the muscles of the arms and legs seize, and less than 45 minutes before the heart stops entirely. The USS Mason had transitioned its primary mission from hunting the Kazan to a mass casualty recovery operation. From the side of the destroyer, 2 rigid-hull inflatable boats were lowered into the churning 4-meter swells, their engines screaming, as they bounced over the crests toward the bobbing orange specks of life vests. The sailors in the boats worked with a frantic, mechanical speed, reaching into the oily water to haul shivering, oil-slicked men over the rubber pontoons. The air was filled with the sound of the wind, the rhythmic slapping of waves against the hull, and the guttural, rhythmic coughing of men who had swallowed a mixture of seawater and burning fuel. The smell was a nauseating blend of salt, burnt rubber, and the metallic tang of blood. High above, the MH-60 Sierra helicopter from the Mason's flight deck hovered in a precarious stationary position, its rescue hoist cable vibrating in the gale force winds. A lone rescue swimmer, suspended by a thin steel wire, descended into the center of a group of 5 survivors clinging to a floating piece of the frigate's helicopter hangar. The downwash from the rotor blades whipped the sea into a blinding white spray, making it nearly impossible for the swimmer to see. One by one, the survivors were winched into the cabin of the helicopter, where they were immediately wrapped in silver mylar thermal blankets and hooked up to portable oxygen tanks. The logistics of the rescue were a nightmare of weight and balance. The helicopter could only carry 8 survivors at a time before reaching its maximum takeoff weight, requiring a constant, fuel-hungry shuttle service back to the destroyer's flight deck. 80 miles to the south, at the Port of Gdansk, the medical crisis was even more acute. The primary warehouse of the deepwater container terminal, which had survived the blast but was now coated in a thick layer of black soot, had been converted into an improvised casualty collection point. The air inside the warehouse was cold and smelled of damp concrete and the sharp chemical bite of antiseptic. Over 450 personnel, a mixture of United States Marines, Polish soldiers, and civilian dock workers, lay on green canvas litters arranged in neat, tragic rows. The mass cal protocol was in full effect, with medical officers moving from patient to patient, marking their foreheads with colored tape to indicate the priority of their injuries. The logistical bottleneck for medical supplies was reaching a critical point. The destruction of the primary rail line and the severance of the highway bridge meant that the push of emergency medical crates from the regional hub in Poznan was stalled 60 kilometers away. The warehouse was running low on morphine, specialized burn dressings, and O-negative whole blood units. The medical staff was forced to perform advanced trauma surgery under the flickering light of battery-powered LED lanterns, their hands shaking from exhaustion and the sub-zero temperatures. Every 30 minutes, a pair of MH-60 Sierra helicopters landed in the soot-covered parking lot to evacuate the most critical red tag patients to the Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. But the air bridge was too thin to handle the volume of the wounded. The psychological toll on the recovery teams was becoming visible. The Marines of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, who had been trained for the fast-paced violence of an amphibious assault, were now carrying the blackened remains of their comrades out of the wreckage of the truck park. Their faces were masks of charcoal dust and sweat, their eyes hollow and fixed on the ground. The environment of the port had become a sensory trap. The sound of the port, nearby fuel fires, still roaring with a low-frequency hum, acted as a constant reminder of the failure of the defensive perimeter, the golden hour of trauma care. The critical window in which a life can be saved after a major injury had long since passed for many of the men trapped in the lower decks of the USS Brittin. As the morning progressed, the recovery effort expanded to include environmental containment. Teams of Polish civilian contractors in yellow hazardous material suits began deploying floating orange booms around the sinking hull of the frigate and the burning piers of Gdansk. They were trying to contain the thousands of liters of oil and hydraulic fluid that were now hemorrhaging into the Baltic Sea, creating an ecological catastrophe to match the military one. The smell of the chemicals was so strong it caused the workers to vomit into their masks, yet they continued to pull the heavy, oil-soaked barriers through the water. The war had moved into a phase of slow, agonizing salvage, where every life saved and every liter of fuel contained was a small, bitter victory against the ghost in the deep. 7:30 in the morning, Ramstein Air Base, Germany, and the operational headquarters of the United States Transportation Command. Inside the hardened concrete shell of the Combined Air Operations Center, the atmosphere was defined by a cold, mathematical desperation. The air was thick with the smell of scorched coffee and the low-frequency hum of hundreds of server racks processing the wreckage of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's Eastern Logistics Plan. On the main tactical display, the Port of Gdansk was no longer a blue icon of Allied strength. It was a pulsing red circle, a wound in the geography of the continent that was bleeding out the Alliance's ability to sustain a high-intensity mechanized war. The strategic objective for the logistics commanders was the immediate establishment of the secondary artery, a frantic, multimodal effort to reroute 45,000 tons of incoming military hardware and fuel that was currently at sea, heading straight for a port that no longer existed. The primary concern was the second wave of the armored reinforcement, led by the United States naval ship Bob Hope, which was carrying another full brigade of 60 M1A2 SEPV-3 tanks and 80 Bradley fighting vehicles. This vessel was currently 600 miles west of the English Channel, and if it could not find a secure berth within 48 hours, the front lines in the Suwalki Gap would face a terminal ammunition and armor deficit that the Russian Federation would exploit with total impunity. The logistics of rerouting were a nightmare of draft depths, crane capacities, and rail gauge compatibility. The Port of Gdynia, located just 20 miles to the west of Gdansk, was the most logical alternative, but intelligence reports from the P-8 Poseidon indicated that the Kazan had likely laid mines in the narrow approaches to the harbor before its final breakout. The port of Szczecin, at coordinates 53 degrees 35 minutes north, 14 degrees 33 minutes east, was deeper and more secure, but its rail connections to the east were narrow and passed through several vulnerable bridge bottlenecks that were currently being shadowed by Russian long-range strike aircraft. "We are looking at a total collapse of the just-in-time delivery window," the logistics director stated, his voice a flat, mechanical rasp over the secure voice link to Washington. Without Gdansk, we are forced to offload heavy armor in Wilhelmshaven, Germany, and then move it over 1,500 kilometers by rail and heavy equipment transport. We are adding 72 hours to the transit time for every single tank. The fuel burn alone for the truck convoys will deplete our regional reserves by 15% every single day. To mitigate the disaster, the United States Air Force initiated Operation Iron Bridge, a massive emergency airlift designed to bypass the sea lane's entirely critical Class 5 supplies, ammunition, and medical crates. At Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, 20 C-5M Super Galaxy aircraft and 40 C-17 Globemaster III transports began a continuous cycle of launches, their cavernous holds filled to the ceiling with 155mm artillery shells and anti-tank missiles. The air over the Atlantic became a conveyor belt of screaming jet engines, with aircraft landing at Spangdahlem Air Base in Germany every 12 minutes to offload and refuel before heading back across the ocean. The environment at these transition hubs was a scene of industrial fury. The cold German morning was filled with the smell of burnt JP-8 fuel and the high-pitched whine of heavy-duty forklifts. Ground crews worked in 12-hour shifts, their faces blackened by soot and their hands numbed by the freezing wind. Every pallet of ammunition moved was a calculated risk. The aircraft were flying at maximum weight, pushing their airframes to the absolute limit of their structural integrity. The Logistics Command was essentially trying to rebuild a demolished bridge while the Army was still community, trying to cross it, and the cracks were appearing in every link of the chain. The strategic ripple effect was already being felt at the front. In eastern Poland, the commanders of the 3rd Infantry Division were being told to ration their artillery fire to 20 rounds per battery per day. The high-speed, high-technology warfare that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had perfected was being choked by the lack of basic consumables. The Kazan had not just destroyed a pier, it had forced the most advanced military force in human history to revert to the attritional, slow-moving logistics of the 20th century. As the sun rose higher over the administrative buildings of Ramstein, the logistics reports continued to darken. The 48-hour bottleneck was no longer a theoretical projection. It was a physical reality that was slowing the movement of every tank, every bullet, and every gallon of fuel across the European theater. The war had become a race between the Russian ability to strike the next hub and the American ability to build a new one out of the ruins. The unanswered question was whether the thin, overstretched line of C-17 transports could hold the weight of a continent's defense until the sea lanes were secured once again. 5 days after the strike. The Port of Gdansk. The fires that had consumed the fuel farm and the ammunition piers were finally reduced to a smoldering, low-temperature crawl, leaving behind a landscape of blackened concrete and twisted skeletal steel that stretched for 3 kilometers along the Baltic coast. The air was no longer thick with the immediate heat of the explosions, but it carried a persistent, sickly sweet smell of cold ash, burnt polymer, and the heavy, metallic scent of the thousands of tons of spilled oil that had coated every surface in a thick, black lacquer. The silence over the terminal was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, hollow clanging of a loose steel cable hitting a buckled crane, and the distant, muffled thud of demolition charges as United States Army engineers began the months-long process of clearing the deep-water berths. The final strategic assessment of the strike was a document of profound and unprecedented loss for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The United States European Command confirmed the total destruction of 60 M1A2 SEPV-3 main battle tanks, 140 Bradley fighting vehicles, and 300,000 rounds of 155mm high-explosive ammunition. These losses represented more than just high-cost military hardware. They were the entire spearhead of the planned spring counteroffensive. The iron throat of the eastern flank had not just been restricted, it had been surgically removed. The casualty count had settled at 412 personnel killed in action, with another 780 suffering from life-altering, blast injuries, and chemical exposure, making it the deadliest single engagement for the Alliance since the beginning of the conflict. The logistical ripple effect was a paralysis that moved through the entire theater of operations at the speed of a digital report. The planned advance of the 3rd Infantry Division toward the Suwalki Gap was officially postponed by a minimum of 21 days, a window of time that allowed Russian ground forces to reinforce their defensive lines with 3 additional motorized rifle brigades and 2,000 kilometers of new trench systems. The just-in-time supply model had been shattered, forced back into a just-in-case posture that required massive, inefficient stockpiles of equipment to be held in deep interior hubs in Germany and France, far beyond the reach of a single submarine strike, but hundreds of miles from the men who needed them. At coordinates 69 degrees north, 33 degrees east, the Kazan slipped into the frozen waters of the Severomorsk naval base under the cover of a heavy Arctic blizzard. The submarine's hull was scarred by the high-pressure depth charges of the USS Mason and the thermal stress of its own high-speed breakout. But its mission was an unqualified success. For the cost of 32 cruise missiles and 2 torpedoes, a single vessel had achieved a strategic outcome that an entire field army would have struggled to produce. Captain First Rank Denisov and his crew were met with the silent, professional approval of the Northern Fleet Command. Their ghost-like transit through the Baltic, now a case study in the lethal efficiency of underwater asymmetrical warfare. The environment of northern Poland remained a testament to the vulnerability of modern industrial power. The Bay of Gdansk, once a vital artery of European trade and security, was now an environmental exclusion zone where the salt spray carried the persistent grit of vaporized military equipment. The wind from the northeast continued to whip the black, oily surface of the water, pushing the debris of the USS Brittin and the Polish frigate Pulaski against the remains of the pier. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was left to rebuild its strength, one pallet and one tank at a time, moving through a logistics chain that was now defined by caution, delay, and the constant, nagging fear of what else might be moving in the lightless depths of the sea. The war would continue, but the geography of the conflict had been permanently altered. The smoking ruins of the pier were no longer a hub of transition. They were a monument to the day the logistics of a continent were broken by a single ghost in the deep. The sun finally broke through the layer of soot at noon, casting a cold, pale light over the wreckage of the tanks and the silent, empty cranes. There were no victory parades in Gdansk, only the sound of heavy machinery and the realization that the cost of defending the East had just become immeasurably higher.